The Casablanca Declaration, narrated by Sasha Maggio. I would like to use today's thread to touch on a few additional points regarding the Casablanca Conference and the Casablanca Declaration. This conference was significant for a number of reasons. For starters, this meeting was important for unifying the Allies' strategy. Every nation involved had their own concept of how they thought a post-World War II world should look, but the only real way to win was to win together. In order to do that, our leaders and planners had to figure out how we would all contribute to winning the war, the best courses of action to commit to for this year, 1943, what the end of the war would look like, in other words, define success, and what that meant for everyone that was involved. Operation Torch was successful, but when the American forces first came ashore in North Africa, many were facing Vichy French forces, and this was not a good example of what they will face as the North Africa campaign progresses. Speaking of the French, we now had Free French forces and prominent French generals on our side. They needed to be included, and the Allied leaders and planners had to figure out how best to do that. There were considerations in the Casablanca Conference that I have yet to really cover, such as the dangers in the Atlantic posed by U-boats and the horrific losses being seen daily on the Eastern Front. And despite those losses, the Allies needed the Soviets to stay in the fight. We knew eventually a cross-channel invasion of the European continent was going to happen, but it would not be possible if we did not build up forces in the UK first. At the same time, forces in such large numbers weren't all available yet, so we'd have to wait regardless. By continuing to fight in North Africa, we stood a chance of gaining more control of the Mediterranean, invading Europe, and taking Italy out of the fight, thereby denying Hitler Italian support. This was not the focus the American planners wanted, but it is what was decided on. Churchill had expressed concern over post-World War II Soviet aims, but we could not worry about that at this time. The pressing issue was to keep supplying the Soviets with resources to the best of our ability, so they could keep fighting the Nazis in the East. The Casablanca Conference discussed the strategy for the Pacific Theater too. While I am not covering the PTO, Pacific Theater of Operations, the Marine Corps Museum is, and it's important to understand that our resources, including troops, had to supply and fight in the Pacific as well. The Casablanca Declaration was the finished result of the Casablanca Conference, a unified statement from the Allied leaders regarding the conditions for ending the Second World War. Ultimately, unconditional surrender. The phrase was actually inspired by the U.S. Army Civil War general and former President U.S. Grant, whom Roosevelt noted was also referred to as unconditional surrender Grant. Like Grant against the Confederate States in the American Civil War, FDR and the Allies would require the unconditional surrender of each of the Axis nations in order to successfully end this world war. We are a couple weeks early for it, but on 12 February 1943, FDR gave a radio address to the nation in which he explained what is meant by unconditional surrender. FDR explained, "We mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution upon their guilty, barbaric leaders." This stance was not taken lightly. The decision to require the unconditional surrender of each of the Axis nations was made jointly by FDR and Churchill, Stalin informed later, and the decision was made with input from senior personnel such as U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. Marshall believed that this would boost morale for the Allies and also provide some relief and reassurance for the Soviet leadership that the Allies were, in fact, in it to win it. The Allies needed the Soviets to continue keeping Hitler's forces busy in the East. The longer that Hitler fought on the Eastern Front, the more time this bought the Allies to prepare to attack in the West, and the greater the likelihood that Hitler's forces would substantially deplete resources beyond their capacity to replenish them. FDR and Churchill also knew that they needed to reassure Stalin of their commitment to supporting the Soviets as well, in order to keep him from making decisions that would undermine the Allied effort, such as negotiating a separate peace with Hitler. Keep in mind that before Hitler started World War II, the Soviet Union had provided some support for rearmament and training, as Nazi Germany developed Hitler's war machine, and until Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the two leaders did have a non-aggression pact. As noted on Saturday, part of the solidified Allied strategy was now to work toward the total destruction of the economic and military power of all our adversaries at a rate exceeding their power of replacement. In other words, we needed to destroy the Axis nations' ability to continue to make war. But this did not mean destroying the people, which FDR made a point to clarify. Having something formalized that the Allied leaders could all sign might have been more symbolic than anything. Some note that there was the possibility the British would support negotiations that kept the German army intact for use against the Soviets, foreseeing that problem. As long as Hitler was in control in Nazi Germany and causing problems for all of Europe, if not the world, the stance taken was the only reasonable one the Allies could settle on. It has also been noted that Allen Dulles, the American chief of OSS operations in Switzerland, felt that the Casablanca Declaration was merely a piece of paper to be scrapped without further ado if Germany should sue for peace, but that Hitler had to go in order for that to happen. We also got the Casablanca Directive as a result of some of the meetings held during the Casablanca Conference, and this directive dealt with the application of air power from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces. Although it won't be issued to the commanders of the RAF and the USAAF until the beginning of February 1943, this directive will be the focus for the Allied air power for the next 14 or so months, setting priorities for strategic bombing and setting the stage for Operation Point Blank. We will talk about Operation Point Blank later this year, but it was a combined bombing offensive with both the USAAF and the RAF working together to destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter strength, which was an important step to getting us to a cross-channel invasion of the continent. The progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. In his radio address, FDR reminded the American people, "It is one of our war aims that the conquered populations of today be again the masters of their destiny." There must be no doubt anywhere that it is the unalterable purpose of the United Nations to restore to conquered peoples their sacred rights. Thank you for joining me today. The references included in the Twitter thread presented here are linked below in the description. If you are a fan of this content, please consider subscribing to my accounts on any or all platforms, as that helps me know the content is worth the effort. And stick around, this might be the best series yet.